You're listening to Boomers Today with your host, Frank Sampson.
Well, welcome to Boomers Today. I'm your host, Frank Sampson. Of course, each week we bring you important and useful information on issues facing baby boomers, their parents, and other loved ones. And I just can't thank all of you enough for all your support. Our listeners keep growing each and every day, and it's because of you sharing podcasts with friends and family members and associates. And of course, many of you are listening to it maybe when you go for your walks in the morning. Certainly it's on Apple Podcasts, on Google Podcasts, Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, a number of them. So again, thank you for all of that. And it's because we have wonderful guests. And again, we're not going to disappoint you at all today at all. So we have today with us Dr. Jonathan Baktari, who is a healthcare CEO, a vaccine and COVID-19 expert, and a physician with specialties in internal, pulmonary, and critical care medicine. He and his team at E7 Health specialize in preventative medicine, vaccinations, and testing for viruses. In short, Dr. Baktari was an expert on COVID before COVID even existed. Dr. Baktari, thank you so much for joining us on Boomers today.
Oh, Frank, it's an honor. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is certainly such an important subject matter. But before we get into discussion about COVID, coronavirus, all of that, tell us a little bit more about E7 Health.
Yeah, well, E7 Health is a preventative health and wellness company. In one way or another, we've been around since 1994. We don't do primary care, urgent care. All we really focus on are preventable illnesses, especially vaccine-related illnesses. And we do physicals, both executive and employee and student physicals, and we do testing, anything that involves preventive health and wellness. So sort of we've been focusing on that at the exclusion of, seeing primary care people, which of course we refer to great doctors. And this allows us to really, focus on what we do, and especially adult vaccines and preventing vaccine preventable illnesses. We've been focusing on that for a long time. So that's what we do.
Such an important subject matter. So I'm going to throw something at you right off the bat here. Not an easy one, I'm sure. But are we going to be living with some form of coronavirus or COVID? I hope I'm using the right terms because you hear both. I don't know if that's synonymous or what, but are we going to be living with this virus or some form of it in the years to come?
Well, I think the answer to that is really to go back in time and see what we were living with in 2019 and prior. And what we were living in 2019 and prior is basically coronaviruses anyway. So in other words, I tell people like a third of all the colds you ever got in your life were coronaviruses, cousins of this virus. And so we have been living with it for decades. And people would, every few years get a new coronavirus infection, meaning a new cold. And we've been living with it. I think what makes this strain unique is how lethal it is in a select group of people. I mean, in other words, when you look at the group that's, above 50, 60, certainly 70, 80, and when you look at people with comorbidity, it has a high mortality rate. But in every other way, it acts like a cold virus. So it's an upper respiratory cold virus that we've been living with forever. And this particular COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 strain is just more lethal in that subpopulation. And that's really the only difference. So to kind of answer your question in a roundabout way, we have been living with it. This is just a tougher strain.
Okay, makes sense. So, I want to talk about maybe some myths, but I have just a question leading up to it that also may be a myth. All right, and that is, If everybody was vaccinated, I know
Hmm.
that's probably going to be an impossibility, but if everybody was
Right.
vaccinated, would this end, or could it still continue and other variants forming?
Yeah, I mean, so here's all of this really is more of a mathematical answer. The more people we get vaccinated, and the more people that actually get the disease, meaning develop natural immunity, will make the likelihood of a mutation, a mutated variant, less likely, or it will take longer to occur. So certainly, if nobody was vaccinated, we'd have more deltas and omicron because the virus mutates based on the number of people it infects and the number of times it replicates. So without getting into statistical jargon, the less number of times it replicates, the less likely there is to be a mutation. The way kind of look at it in layman's term, imagine you had to put a Lego set together 100 times versus 1,000 times. If one person had to put the same Lego set together 100 times and one person had to put the Lego set together 1,000 times, which person is more likely to make an error when all is said, when they've accomplished their task?
Right.
The
Right.
person who had to
Yeah.
put the model together 1,000 times.
Hmm.
And mutations are errors, and Omicron, Delta were errors made by the original virus, and so the more it replicates, the more it has a chance to do it wrong, and sometimes that wrong mutation helps the virus.
Hmm.
If in around, and many times it hurts the virus and kills the virus, but many times these mutations helps, gives it survival advantage to infect others. So the less it replicates, the less Lego sets we put together, the less likely we are to find a new bad variant. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, no, it does. I mean, can these various mutations work side by side in the long run? In other words, let's say a Delta and an Omicron, could they both continue? Does one kind of, I don't know, take over the other, or that's not
Yeah,
reality?
yeah, that I mean, it doesn't have to. I mean, the Omicron may have nothing to do with the Delta strain. It could have been a Delta strain or a regular strain that just mutated. I don't think necessarily they have to build on each other, although it can. Um, but however you get there, the more mutations that occur, that and if those mutations give the virus some sort of advantage over the older version, that then it tends to become an ever-growing percentage of all the infections because it has a good survival advantage. So as you look at these mutations, you have to understand 99.999% of all the mutations are bad for the virus. But occasionally, a series of mutations gives it an advantage. And because it has an advantage, it tends to then have a better chance of spreading through the population because
Got
it
it.
has a slight advantage over the old version.
Got it. Got it. Interesting. So myths. All right. I'm sure you've heard them all. But
Hmm.
why don't you just expound upon some of the myths that you hear and maybe try to clear up some things? Let's do a little fact check here.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah. Well, I mean, the biggest myth I see with the vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccine, is really the myth I see with all vaccines because there's something, people have this tendency to say, well, I don't want, medication. I don't want foreign stuff injected in my body. I want, only natural. I want to take zinc and I want to take this and I want to take only natural minerals and vitamins and I don't want, chemicals. And I think that's really a myth because really vaccines are not drugs. In fact, they're called biologics. They're not even considered drugs. And basically, in the purest sense, although mRNA vaccines are slightly different, in the purest sense, a vaccine, sort of in a classical version, is the corpse of the bug you're trying to avoid to get. Whatever bug you're trying to avoid is the corpse put in a blender, chopped up, and injected back into you So your body's fooled into thinking it's really seeing the bug. Now that's there are other ways of presenting that to your body, but in the classic sense, so nothing is more natural than a vaccine. Now people argue, well, there's impurities and other chemicals in it. Let's put that aside for a second. There's nothing more pure than in terms of natural strategy than a vaccine, because all we're doing is putting some version of the nose or elbow or knee of the bug into you, and your body thinks it's seeing the actual virus or bacteria, and your body makes natural immunity, antibodies and T cells and what have you, to the elbow and knee that we're injecting into you. So for the people who like natural stuff, they love aromatherapy and they love acupuncture and they do yoga, whatever. To me, honestly, nothing is more natural than getting a vaccine. That should be in the same, kind of category as all of the quote unquote natural stuff, which, by the way, I value a lot. I'm just saying I think vaccines should be in that category. Now, are there impurities or preservatives or whatever people think? Yes, and that has been decreasing over the past decades. How pure the vaccines are. Yeah, and yes, are there side effects to certain vaccines? Even because of that strategy, yes. But that would apply to an aspirin and Tylenol and to almost anything. So, but in terms of broadly speaking, it's such a very natural strategy to give you something so your own body creates, because the vaccine, disappears in, like with mRNA vaccines, the vaccine disappears in 48 hours. Why are you still protected 6 months later? It's because of your natural immunity. It's not the vaccine fighting the virus. The vaccine never fights the virus. It's what your body does in response to the vaccine that fights the virus or bacteria. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And actually, it's never been explained to me that way. And I guess I ask you, why isn't our government and all the doctors that are interviewed, all these specialists interviewed on TV and asking opinions, how come they don't explain it this way?
Well, I think part of it is we've been a vaccine. We used to be called the Vaccine Center since E7 was called the Vaccine Center until 2017 when we rebranded because people thought all we did was vaccine. So, but we, this is all we do. We don't do anything else. We're not, treating colds or migraines or anything. All we do are adult vaccine medicine. So maybe in that sense, this is really, we live and breathe this 24 hours a day.
Yeah, things that I've heard, what would you say to someone who says, well, my child had a horrible reaction to vaccines when they were younger, and I'm afraid to give them a vaccine, any type of additional vaccine because of that horrible reaction they had. How do you respond to something like that?
I totally respect that, and depends what that reaction was. Certainly there are children that have an allergic response to certain vaccines. The cap is made out of latex, so they can have a latex allergy. It's really important to follow up and see what that allergy was and to what. Some vaccines are egg-based, and so then you have to avoid egg-based vaccines because they use basically chick eggs to incubate some of the stuff. So it's not as simple as saying, no one would ever say, hey, I'm allergic to antibiotics, so never give me any antibiotic, right? So what you would do is say, okay, are you allergic to penicillin? Are you allergic to another class of antibiotics? What was your reaction? What was unique about that particular antibiotic that we think caused that? And then you have a strategy to pick and choose which vaccine you're going to avoid as opposed to just as a class. We don't do that with any other class where we just say, I'm never going to take any migraine medicine, or I'm never going to take any, ulcer medicine, or I'm never going to take because I had a bad reaction. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. So, could there be something in the vaccines that are given for COVID, truly something in there that maybe somebody would react to based on their past? Is that a possibility?
Well, we know the data. If you really think over 200 million Americans have already gotten the mRNA vaccine, We already know what percent have a side effect, and it's a very small, I mean, major side effects. If
Right.
the largest, people always say, the big enough study hasn't been done yet. In many ways, the mRNA vaccines, because they're given to everybody, if you look at what's happened in the past year and a half, we've now done the world's largest study in mankind looking at any vaccine, right? Because we've never had to give out literally the entire 2/3 of the country, a vaccine. So we know now, we have that data. Yes, we have the data after the vaccine was essentially had emergency use approval or authorization, but nonetheless, we now have the data. In other words, when people say the study, I only want a vaccine that's been studied thoroughly. We've never ever in the history of mankind have given a vaccine to 200 million people in a year and now have the data on it. That's some pretty
Right.
amazing studies.
Yeah, it is.
I
It
mean,
is.
if you look at it that way, if I came to you and said, "Hey, there's a new vaccine that just came out, and we've tested it on 200 million people, and this is the data," you say, "Oh, well, if you've tested on 200 million people, I'm comfortable now." So the people who are still not comfortable after 200 million people have gotten the dose, I don't know when they would be comfortable.
Right. I mean, at the beginning, because this was pretty amazing how quickly this vaccine,
Hmm.
came to market, right? And some
Right.
said, "Oh, it was too quick. It was just too quick. I don't want to get it.
Right.
I want to give it time." But was it that quick?
Right.
In other words, was it already in development, or were they starting from square one?
Well, no, no, I would agree with those people. I mean, let's be fair. Yes, mRNA technology had been on the shelf for at least a decade. Looking at it, if to treat cancer and other stuff, and some they were just coming out looking at it for certain viruses too. But yes, I mean, it literally, normally it takes a vaccine 5 to 10 years to be rolled out. We did it in less than 12 months. That would be science fiction a few years ago. So yes, I mean in that sense it was rushed out. The mRNA technology had been around, and yes, but you have to look at we've already lost 800,000 people, and almost the vast majority of those 800,000 people that have died in the United States were unvaccinated. So are we going to wait until another 800,000 people die and then we are okay with the vaccine? So I mean it's a risk benefit analysis, and however we got there, the benefit was worth the risk because we now have given the vaccine out to 200 million people plus, and we know it's amazingly safe. So
Yeah, this is fascinating information. So we're going to take a real quick break here. I promise we'll be real short. And when we come back, I just want to recognize our sponsor. When we come back, let's talk about what maybe the new normal is going to look like. How about that? All right.
okay,
Great.
okay.
So, do you know anybody who may be concerned about an older driver? Well, Senior Care Authority's Beyond Driving with Dignity program is a facilitated self assessment program for older drivers. This program has been designed to serve as a vital tool to facilitate older drivers and their families as they make appropriate decisions regarding the future of one's safe driving career. If the individual is a safe driver, an advisor will provide him or her with strategies on how to remain a safe driver as they progress through the aging process. If driving retirement is the appropriate decision, then the individual and their family are offered possible alternatives, resources, and a specific plan to ensure a smooth and successful transition from the driver's seat to the passenger seat. So to learn more, you can go to www.beyonddrivingwithdignity.com or call 877-907-8841 to connect with a Senior Care Authority advisor in your area. We're back with Dr. Jonathan Baktari, who's a healthcare CEO and COVID-19 expert. And he's with E7 Health. And maybe before we talk about the new normal, Dr. Baktari, maybe you could share with our listeners a little bit more on how they might be able to learn more about E7 and any other information you'd like to share.
Yeah, E7, people can reach us at e7health.com, just the letter E and the number 7, e7health.com. If they want to reach out to me, my website is baktarimd.com, baktarimd.com, or we do a lot of educational stuff on COVID and other things on our YouTube channel, Baktari MD on YouTube. So those are all three good ways to reach out and learn more about what we do.
Great, great. All right, wonderful. So it appears, and again, before we came on the air, we were talking about the term pandemic, and you shared a term with me that I hadn't heard before, saying that it may not be a pandemic. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, yeah. So I think up until now, I think especially when the pandemic started, I think the idea was that this would be a pandemic and we'd come out with a vaccine and it would resolve and go away. And I think what's really happening is we have to really start to assume that this virus is going to be with us long term. And it has been with us. This version of the coronavirus is going to be with us long term, and it's going to be endemic. And the classical definition of endemic means a disease regularly found among particular people or in certain areas. So like often they say, like a certain flower is endemic to the East Coast, or is found in a certain area. And I think it just becomes a native kind of thing slowly. Now, is it possible that, so many people will get the virus and vaccine that we'll stop having new variants and this will fade away? Of course. But more than likely, I think some version of it is going to be with us for a long time. And the question really is, are we eventually going to move on to the strategy of dealing with it like we do with the flu? I mean, nobody walks around saying, hey, when are we going to get rid of the flu, or when are we going to get rid of colds? Although that would be amazing. I think we have to slowly start thinking about it in that sense, and potentially even yearly shots, just like we do the flu shot. So I think we have to maybe evolve and look at it more like we do the flu than we do like a once in a century pandemic.
Right. So my youngest grandchild is 4 years old. She doesn't know or wouldn't remember not having to wear a mask. All right.
Mm-hmm.
She just wouldn't know. I mean, she just wears a mask all the time, Do you feel that will change?
Well, I think that's more somewhat of my philosophy, to kind of answer your question in a roundabout way. I think it's very, very important that we protect people who are super vulnerable to catching this illness. In terms of long-term, precautions for people who are at low risk, I don't know. I think that might evolve. I mean, I think it will evolve. I think as more and more people get the disease, get reinfected, get the vaccine, get newer versions of the vaccine, and as we take extra steps to protect the vulnerable, meaning seniors and people with pre-existing conditions and stuff. So, if you're asking me, do I think we'll be wearing masks for the rest of our lives? I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
I think we'll come up with a, whether it's that yearly shot or enough people will have caught the disease over the next few years and gotten reinfected that it may develop into a more stable situation. I kind of see that happening more than us wearing masks for the rest of our lives.
Got it. So travel. Any suggestions, recommendations you could give to people who while this is going on, they're traveling, business wise or traveling vacation wise.
Hmm.
Any
Yeah.
suggestions, steps they can take to do the best they can to stay healthy while traveling?
Uh, yeah. I mean, I think number one is make sure you get your third shot. That's critical. Uh, it's not even a booster anymore. It's a three-shot series, and that should be clear to everybody. So get your booster. Uh, if you don't have any other risk factors, then just take the natural precautions that we all talk about, as well as get your third shot. If you have risk factors, obviously get your third shot, but then really do more of a risk benefit analysis when you get into high risk situations. Okay, so in other words, if you're not going to be doing high risk behavior, which is super big crowds, large groups of people, very close to each other, if you're at risk, then you have to assess, whether how important it is for you to be there. Uh, Again, those are for people who are older and who have, uh, underlying pre-existing conditions. If you have a lot of pre-existing conditions and you're older, you just have to assess that versus, not doing that activity. We call it, there's a reason why life insurance companies ask you before they give you a policy, do you skydive?
Right.
Why are they asking that question?
Of
Right?
course.
Well, they're
Right.
saying that's a pretty high risk activity,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So you kind of have to look at, your exposure to COVID as every activity you do, whether that's low, moderate, high, severely high risk. So that's the way. If you categorize it like that, there is helicopter skiing and hang gliding and rock climbing and jumping out of planes. Majority of people do fine, but it's a high risk activity. And, to a certain extent, you have to view getting into super large crowds as somewhat of a high risk activity, especially if it's indoors versus outdoors, if it's poor ventilation, great ventilation. All of that assesses the risk of the activity. So if someone says, "Hey, is mountain climbing worse than hang gliding?" Who knows? But I mean, certain things have more risk than others. They're not. If I went to an indoor event and there was low ceilings with poor ventilation, that's not the same thing as going to a big event like in a big indoor football stadiums where the ceilings are super high and there's great ventilation. So it's not always, should I go to a football game or should I go to a holiday party that's indoors with low ceilings and poor ventilation? They're both large crowds, but one is less risky than the other.
Makes perfect sense. Great. So we only have literally a minute or two left. I know there's a part of your organization that specializes in what you have named travel medicine. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and then also share again after your contact information again, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Yeah. Yeah, well, what most people don't know is, if you're traveling to any developing countries, whether it's Central, South America, Africa, Asia, you probably need to see a travel medicine expert. One, to get counseling on how to stay safe, but also to get a lot of travel vaccines that people weren't aware of, like yellow fever vaccine, Japanese encephalitis vaccine, typhoid vaccine, as well as getting, like I said, counseling. So I think I think it's very, very important. This has been going on before COVID, but I think COVID has brought the risk of catching certain infectious diseases back to the forefront. So yeah, so if you're traveling to any of those developing nations, please, 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 see a travel medicine expert. They exist in every town, and reach out and get a full consultation, and they'll tell you what vaccines and preparations you need to make before you travel to those countries.
How did it? Could they contact your group to put them in touch with somebody locally, or are they pretty easy to find?
Well, the CDC actually has a directory. So if you go to cdc.gov and type in travel medicine, all the clinics in the U.S. who are certified are on the CDC website. Of course, if you're anywhere near Southern Nevada, you're welcome to come see us at E7 Health. But otherwise, the CDC has a really extensive list of all the travel medicine clinics in the United States.
Great. Dr. Jonathan Baktari, thank you so much for joining us on Boomers Today. Check it out at e7health.com. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Boomers Today with Frank Sampson. To learn more about today's show, visit boomerstodayradio.com and join us next time for another edition of Boomers Today.